Hello and welcome. Let's chat for a few minutes about Testaments of Time, The Search for Lost Manuscripts and Records by Leo Deuel, which is the most recent book that I finished. Following this chat, I'll also touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading, as well as I'll do a drawing to let the random universe choose the next book that I'll be reading off of my priority list for 2018, so stay tuned for that. But this is Testaments of Time's moment in the spotlight, so let's get back to the chat. This book was originally published in 1965. I bought this book off the used book market, off the internet, and so I get the feeling it probably had a dust jacket at one time. But there is the title page that shows up a little bit better than the spine. There, Testaments of Time, The Search for Lost Manuscripts and Records by Leo Deuel, published in 1965. This is a work of nonfiction. I selected this work for my 2018 priority list because of the theme of books about books was one of my themes that I was reading for 2018, and so this was one of my selections around that theme. I heard about this book through Richardson Reed's BookTube channel. He was doing a lot of shelf tours of his personal library, and he owned a copy of this book, and it sounded really interesting to me. I really loved this theme, especially ancient manuscripts and how they were lost for so many centuries in so many cases, and then discovered or rediscovered. And that those kind of stories always sort of fascinate me. And last year I had read a book about the rediscovery of Tacitus's Germania. And so I've found that book so interesting and how that impacted the culture of Germany, and then ultimately the world. And so, I just always find these stories of finding these old ancient works and bringing them back to the general knowledge. I just find these stories really fascinating. So I really wanted to get another book around this topic read this year, and I chose this one. So yeah, what it's about, what I thought I would do is just kind of cover the table of contents, and it'll sort of give you a description about what's really in the book. So the book starts out in book one. It's called A Renaissance Prelude. So this is kind of the Renaissance, the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, when there was this renewed interest first in the works of Rome, and then later from the works of classical Greece. And so there was, among learned people, particularly in Italy, starting out in Italy, there was this really this interest and drive to find works and to search out old libraries and old monasteries and things like this to try to find lost manuscripts, and lots of them were found during this time. The next book two is called The Permanence of Papyrus and Clay Classics. So this is all about the papyruses of Egypt and the search for those, as well as clay tablets of other ancient civilizations. And so how the papyrus of Egypt, sort of how those papyri got conserved in the dry climate of Egypt. Coffins full of knowledge, Flinders Petrie in the Fayum. That's one of the chapters. The Fayum, coffins full of knowledge. There was they found a lot of these works in old refuse dumps where things had been maybe discarded. They were also found a lot of times through the black market, or through the market, the antiquities market in Egypt during this time. This book mostly concerns the 19th century and then the early 20th century. So this was mostly through the 19th century, although even some in the 18th century, and in this part, in the search in Egypt anyway. So, the ancient Near East is the next sort of section, and this is the world's oldest books, the Bible and the Canaanites. I found this section really interesting about, Canaanite, the literature of the Canaanites. A lot of it has been rediscovered, and so we're able to see their myths and, read their myths and know what their myths were, and some of them were precursors to and related to other ideas in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Then book three, The Prevalence of Parchment and the New Testament. So the search for the best New Testament drove a lot of manuscript hunting during the 18th and 19th century in particular, where there was really this drive to find the earliest possible New Testaments, so the earliest possible Christian texts. So, I thought that section was really interesting. Then the next section is called the Hebrew Writs, and this is all about Jewish history, Jewish texts, and whatnot. There was I may be pronouncing this, but Geneza, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but that is a storeroom in usually attached to a synagogue, is my understanding, where writings, when they're worn out, they're not just tossed away. They're put in this storage room, and then they're kept there. Sometimes they're actually eventually buried in a cemetery, but they're kept in these rooms. And there was this one in Cairo that was centuries old, and so when it was rediscovered, it was just a wealth of information about life in the Mediterranean, because not only did it contain religious texts, but it also had letters and contracts and all this type of social documents and records. And so that really shed a light on, what life was like in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean through those centuries. So, then Book 4, A Profusion of Silk, Bark, and Paper. This is talking about Asia, Central Asia, and the movement specifically of Buddhist texts from India into China. And not only that, but, then subsequently that's what drove the original sort of manuscript hunting, but then all sorts of other things wound up getting discovered, which expanded our information on all sorts of topics of that period and that region, that geographical region. And then the next and last section is called the New World, and this was pertaining to Mexico, the civilizations of Mexico and Central America, the Mayan, Aztec, and others, and how they were the interest in those texts was sort of renewed, specifically the late 19th century and the early 20th century, really, it's just remarkable to me after reading this book. It's remarkable. I mean, the surprising thing is how something survived at all. That's really the first takeaway that I had about this book, was just reading the situation that most of these books and records were found in. They're the one of a kinds a lot of times, like major works of major authors from antiquity, come to us today from a single copy, and sometimes a single copy that was just by happenstance saved. And so, to me, that's just fascinating to read about. And so even though this book was written in 1965, this book is still, to me, really relevant. And I'm sure there's been additional scholarship and whatnot since 1965. But like I said, this book mainly concerned records from the 19th century and then the early 20th century. So the way that it was written was extremely engaging. One thing, if you look this up, you will see some really good reviews of it. So it's really puzzling to me why this book is out of print. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But one other thing I wanted to mention about this was the dedicated people. Some of these people who went on these searches for manuscripts are just interesting in and of themselves, and I just find them extremely interesting, and they would be just interesting to read on their own. Some of them had less scruples than others, and some of them, really participated in the sort of really early on, especially early on, before archaeology was really firmly established. They really just were searching for certain things, and so then they just sort of discarded, or they didn't discard it necessarily, but they disregarded anything else that didn't really fit into that. So, when they were searching originally for, Roman manuscripts, they didn't pay a lot of attention to Greek manuscripts because hardly anyone could read Greek in Italy at that time. And so, the same thing for hieroglyphics, but they had not been able to be translated yet, so they couldn't be read. And so, since they were considered undecipherable, then, they were often ignored there at first. And especially the works from Mexico and Central America, which was in a completely different script and completely unknown, and also considered to be never going to be able to be deciphered. And so they just were ignored a lot of times. But just the precariousness of this knowledge that came to us from the ancient world and what we happen to have what happened to have been saved compared to the just probably thousands of works that weren't saved, and just whole literatures of people's missing. In the Mexico and Central America, there was actually a concerted effort by the Spanish conquistadores to destroy their literature. So because they considered it, pagan. So there was, and they almost succeeded. There's very little of their written works that come down to us today. And those that were saved, were found, one time in a used, somebody browsing, a person who happened to know what they were looking for was browsing a used books shop in Mexico City and came across, a text. And this sort of story plays out over and over again, where, the people who knew what they were looking for happened to find these manuscripts and these records and save them from oblivion, sometimes just in the most horrific conditions, which I won't go into, but just amazing to me, how they were saved. So one thing that I wanted to also touch base on was the scripts, because this book, this is the different Latin scripts. This is all written in Latin. So to me, these all look almost like different languages, but the different scripts that are used. And this book has a lot of illustrations about scripts, not just in Latin, but in all of these languages. And so I thought that was real interesting. That helps to date and authenticate ancient manuscripts, I learned through this book. So before I run out of time, I wanted to close the chat with just actually a little paragraph from a work that was rescued from ancient Egypt. So this is from ancient Egypt about books. So the quote is this: "As for those learned scribes who lived after the gods, their names will endure forever, though they are gone and all their relatives are forgotten. They did not make for themselves pyramids of copper with tombstones of iron. They gave themselves the papyrus roll as lector priest, the writing board as a loving son. Books of teachings were their pyramids. The reed pen was their child, and the stone surfaces a wife. More beneficial is a book than a carved stela or a solid tomb wall. A man decays, his corpse is dust, and all his relatives are defunct, but the writings cause his name to be remembered in the mouth of the orator. More beneficial is a book than the house of the builder or a mortuary chapel in the West." More beneficial is a book than the house of the builder. Yep. So Leo Deuel, thank you for writing this. I am sorry to find out, I guess, that from what I could tell, this book is out of print and has been out of print for a very long time. I think it's the publishing industry, has to be making money on books or else they go out of print. But I hope this book never, becomes a lost manuscript. I hope that it's always around, because it's such a delight to read, such a wonderful experience, that I'm so glad that I chose this one to read among my selections of books about books. But, okay, I'll close the chat on that. What I am currently reading is Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities by Bettany Hughes. This met my priority reading theme of a place. So this is a biography of a city, Istanbul. About 100 pages in so far. Very good, very engaging. So I read a book earlier this year on Istanbul, on Jerusalem. So this one, Istanbul, was another one of my selections around place. So let's do a drawing and see what's next. Let's do this one. See what we got coming up next. Books and readers in the early church. Haha. So this is going to be really timely, because another book about books. Here it is, A History of Early Christian Texts by Harry Y. Gamble. I'll be getting to this book after Istanbul. This book pertains to, this fascinating and lively book provides the first comprehensive discussion of the production, circulation, and use of books in early Christianity. So this book intersects many topics of interest to me: ancient Rome, early Christianity, books about books, ancient manuscripts. So I'll be looking forward to diving into this one once I finish Istanbul. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, take care. Bye.